Hello. I'm back to read chapters 17 and 18 of The Hardy Boys while the clock ticked. I know it's taking me a long time to get through this book, but the next book I'll be probably reading more frequently. So, chapter 17 is called Dangerous Ticking. Frank Hardy's spine tingled. Oh, okay. Sorry. First, I'm going to read the last part of the last chapter. So, it was chapter 16. And, all right. Thunder rumbled in the black sky above as he unlocked the bulkhead. To their surprise, the brothers found the door to the kitchen unlocked. They opened it and tiptoed inside. As the Hardys moved forward in the darkness into the living room, they were suddenly seized and thrown to the floor by someone of enormous strength. Though weary from their long walk, the boys fought back but were overpowered by blows on the head. Frank, semi-conscious, was dragged across the floor, shoved into a chair, and bound to it. A piece of cloth was tied tightly over his mouth. Then the sounds of struggling near him ceased too. Joe, too, had been overpowered. There was silence broken by a single repetitious tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. There was something ominous about the steady, measured sound. Frank, still half dazed, wondered if his brother was in the same room or had been taken to another part of the house. Suddenly, Frank became aware of stealthy footsteps approaching and heavy breathing. The boy felt the hairs on his scalp stiffen as he sensed the presence of someone next to his chair. Was the person the boy's attacker? Frank seethed with chagrin at being unable to defend himself. He tensed, expecting the worst. Okay, now we're reading chapter 17, A Dangerous Ticking. Frank Hardy's spine tingled as he waited for the unknown person's first move. Then, from the darkness came a gloating voice. So, we have trapped the young snoopers. How fortunate that we were ready for your arrival. Suddenly, a low light was turned on, illuminating the living room. In a flash, Frank took in the whole scene. The old draperies had been drawn shut. There was an immense grandfather's clock in the corner. Nearby was his brother Joe, tightly lashed like himself to an old-fashioned high-backed chair. Confronting both boys was a tall, rather heavy-set man wearing glasses. The brothers recognized him instantly. The person who resembled Mr. Dalrymple. He introduced himself as Arthur Jensen, ringleader of the harbor thieves. He must be the one who clobbered us when we came in, Joe told himself. The sneak. Now, the man looked from one of his captives to the other. Surprised you, didn't I? Ha! That'll teach you to meddle in other people's business. Joe felt a sudden surge of anger. Business, he exclaimed to himself. If we ever get out of this mess, I'll show him. Meanwhile, Jensen went on triumphantly. Yes, my young sleuths, we have many more surprises for you this evening. Your friend Dalrymple will be surprised too. And I might add, my resemblance to him has come in very handy. He gazed at the brothers mockingly. You Hardys thought you were so bright. Yet you never dreamed that every time you and the police came in here, we were watching you. Although Frank and Joe gave no visible indication of fear, both realized that they were at the mercy of a clever, unscrupulous gangster. In spite of their predicament, however, the boys wondered who else had been watching them with Jensen and from what point in the house. Just then, there came a squeaky noise from the direction of the clock. Jensen whirled around. "Oh, Amos!" he called out. "Come on out. We have visitors." While Frank and Joe stared in utter amazement, the huge clock and the wall section behind it began sliding to one side. Why, Frank gave an inward gasp. It's a door, hidden by the clock attached to it. In another moment, there emerged from the opening a gaunt, white-haired old man. He was clean-shaven and had kind blue eyes. He started forward, then stopped upon noticing the two boys. "Mr. Jensen," he said uncertainly, "these young men visitors? But why are they bound up in this fashion?" Frank and Joe exchanged puzzled glances. Was this gentle-mannered elderly man connected with Jensen's racket? Somehow he did not seem the type, they thought. "You'll understand in due time, Amos," the gangster leader said with a sneer. Then, noticing the Hardys' curious looks at the old man, Jensen added with mock courtesy, "Oh, excuse me, you haven't been introduced. This, boys, is Mr. Amos Wandy, an inventor. Very clever, too. Amos, these young men are the Hardy brothers." Mr. Wandy nodded slowly. "Yes, I remember having seen them here. You said they were out to wreck your project. But really, they seem like harmless lads. I don't think—" "Never mind what you think," Jensen told the old inventor in a ruthless tone. "Have you finished your job?" "Yes, yes, I have." Amos Wandy looked at Jensen with a perplexed expression. "It's finished. No need to get excited." "Who's excited?" snapped Jensen. "Bring that gadget out here." Mr. Wandy hastened through the open wall section. Arthur Jensen turned to the Hardys. "One of the surprises I mentioned," he told them with a leer. "Even you didn't figure there might be two secret rooms here, did you? Or that I was sitting behind the clock while you or the police snooped around. Only this morning I waited in there while half of the Bayport force inspected the place." Silently, Frank berated himself. Why didn't I think there might be a hiding place behind that clock? Especially after those threatening notes to Mr. Dalrymple. In the meantime, Joe was trying to make sense of what was taking place. Was Arthur Jensen the one who had sent the threatening notes to Dalrymple? And was Wandy in league with him? Joe could not imagine the elderly inventor causing anyone harm. At that moment, Amos Wandy reappeared, gingerly carrying a heavy object that looked like a black box, except it had a number of electrical terminals on one side. "Ah, good," declared Jensen, rubbing his hands. "Know what this is?" he asked the Hardys, pointing to the black box. Frank and Joe realized at once what the object was. A time bomb! The brothers felt a mounting apprehension. "I see you are familiar with this type of apparatus," Jensen went on, chuckling. "Well, old Amos here knows all about bombs, too, don't you? Don't you, Amos?" The old man answered readily. "Yes, I told you that, Mr. Jensen. In the course of my work with electronically activated devices, I naturally—" "Cut the fancy talk," the other man broke in roughly. "All I care about is whether that bomb you're holding has enough juice in it to wipe this pile of bricks right off the map." A hideous wave of panic swept over the Hardys. "Does Jensen mean to blow us up?" Frank asked himself unbelievingly. It was then that the boys noticed Amos Wandy's face. It had turned deathly pale. For a moment he swayed as if about to faint. Then he clutched the deadly-looking device tightly. "What did you say, Mr. Jensen?" he quavered. "You told me this bomb was for some construction work. I don't understand." You soon will, Amos," said the gang leader in a sinister voice. "Put down the bomb. I'll take over." But the old inventor did not comply. He retreated a few steps backward. "No, Mr. Jensen, I fear you are going to use this for some other purpose. An evil purpose. What's more, you have lied to me about these boys. They are your prisoners. In fact, you've lied to me about everything. You never intended to help me market my new invention as you promised." Without warning, Jensen made a lunge for the elderly man and ripped the box from his grasp. The next instant, he knocked the inventor to the floor with a sweep of his big arm. Amos Wandy lay still, stunned. Jensen then put down the bomb and whipped from his pocket a length of rope. He bound the white-haired man's arms and legs securely. "Yes, Amos," he taunted, "these boys are my prisoner, And now so are you. You have been all along. Only you were so wrapped up in your precious invention you never suspected it. Lucky I found you here and had you hoodwinked long enough to put this bomb together. The big man straightened up and, with his eyes burning strangely, went on. Now, all three of you will have the privilege of sharing the success of the explosive at the proper time. Amos Wandy had recovered sufficiently to murmur brokenly, "You, you're insane, Jensen. You can't get away with it." "Can't I? You'll see. But I'd better shut you up before I get to work." Jensen dashed from the room and was back with a piece of cloth with which he gagged Mr. Wandy. "Now, I will proceed with my operation." He gave an exaggerated sigh. "Too bad my pals got caught. I could sure use their help now." The three silenced prisoners watched in growing horror as their captor took several wires from another pocket. He squatted down over the heavy black box. His fingers worked swiftly, attaching the wires to the terminals. He then moved the whole device closer to the clock and ran the wires up into the works. "You see, Amos?" He looked slyly over his shoulder. "I'm pretty good at this sort of thing myself." Jensen stood up, smirking. Dramatically, he pointed to the face of the huge timepiece and faced his captives. "You will note the hour," he said. "I have arranged that when the hands of this clock reach 3, the bomb will be set off." The Hardys stared at the clock face. It was already past 1 o'clock in the morning. For a second, both boys were engulfed by a wave of panic. Through their minds flashed the words of the ominous note, "Death while the clock ticks." But their natural instinct of keeping cool in crises asserted itself. Frank and Joe furtively tried to move their wrists to loosen their bonds. In the meantime, Jensen continued to talk, growing more pleased with himself by the minute. "You remember what you boys overheard in that restaurant?" he reminded them. "Of course, I didn't expect you'd be my guests, or that you'd found my key ring. But you've asked for it. You'll never interfere with me again after tonight. Nor will that pest Dalrymple." Dalrymple! The name echoed through the boys' minds. What had happened to the banker? Was he too a captive somewhere in the shadowy old mansion? All this while, Frank, Joe, and Amos Wandy were acutely aware of the inexorable swinging of the clock's pendulum as the minutes ticked by. Again, the brothers wriggled their wrists and fingers in an effort to loosen the ropes, but the result was only to rub the skin raw. The bonds were cruelly tight. If only, they thought desperately, someone would become anxious because of their long absence and figure out where they were. Aunt Gertrude must be frantic by now, Joe thought hopefully. In the meantime, Arthur Jensen had been eyeing his prisoners smugly. "Well," he said, "I suppose you wonder how I came to discover the hidden room behind the clock, and how nicely it has served my purpose, thanks to Amos here." The gangster went on to explain that when he had first started to use the pretty place to hide stolen valuables, he had come upon Mr. Wandy in the house. "You see," Jensen went on, "Amos told me he was Jason Purdy's cousin. They played here as youngsters. That's how he came to know about both secret rooms. All these years he kept a key to the place. When he retired, old Amos still wanted to fool around with inventing. So he decided to come here and work on some gadgets. He thought nobody would bother him. Well, we met here by accident. I thought his talents would be useful to us, so I told him I'd help him get his inventions on the market when they were ready, if he'd do some work for us." Jensen looked scornfully down at Mr. Wandy, whose blue eyes blazed with anger. "So," the thief continued, "I set up the clock room as a lab, and also a storage place for our loot. Everything went smoothly until that Dalrymple guy came along and bought this place. It was a pain in the neck with his nosing around. That's why I left those notes in the secret room upstairs. Then he had to drag you kids here." The man paused, and a cunning gleam came into his eyes. Bet you boys would like to know how I got the notes in there. Well, that's something you'll never find out now. At least, Joe was thinking bitterly, Jensen was not getting away with most of the stolen goods. He must have the jade stashed behind that clock section, the boy surmised. No doubt you'd like to know about that scream you heard one night. Well, I did that. Pretty effective, wasn't it? Sure scared the wits out of that old fool who came after me. Serves him right. He means Hurt Applegate, Frank thought, thinking wryly that not only were he and Joe unable to help themselves, but in their present state were of no use to Applegate or Dalrymple. Wonder how Dad would get out of such a mess. At this point, Jensen ceased his narrative and glanced at the big clock. The hands stood at 2:15. Well, he said briskly, time is fleeting. I'm going to get out of here, but fast. He hastened to the hidden room behind the clock. The Hardys could hear muffled thumping, as if Jensen were moving cartons. Finally, he reappeared with a heavy canvas sack slung over his shoulder and an armload of small boxes. Suddenly, they all became aware of vivid flashes of lightning, followed by a deafening boom of thunder. Then came a torrential downpour of rain. Storms hit, Jensen said. He added meaningfully, but it's nothing compared to what you'll see at 3:00. He gave a triumphant laugh, ha ha, when he noticed the Hardys staring at his bag and boxes. Oh, yes, he went on, you didn't think I'd leave all this precious jade behind. Not after the trouble I went through to get it. The police can keep the other stuff. Jensen's eyes swept the room and came to rest on the 3 bound and gagged figures. I've enjoyed your visit, he laughed again. I'll leave the light on so you can watch to time. Goodbye. He left the room. Another moment, the boys heard the front door open, then slam shut. Almost automatically, the 3 captives turned their gaze toward the grandfather's clock. 3:15. Joe's mouth felt parched, and beads of sweat broke out on his forehead. He and Frank and Amos Wandy could only wait and listen to the deadly sound of the clock. Tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18. The Slippery Rooftop. The fiend! Frank gritted his teeth. Jensen's really left us here to be blown sky high. Desperately, he strained his arms and legs against the rough ropes that cut into his flesh. It was to no avail. Then he lurched forward, trying to overturn the chair, with the thought of working himself across the floor toward the time bomb. This attempt proved futile, too. Joe, meanwhile, was squirming and twisting his body in an effort to get his penknife, but his fingers would reach no farther than the edge of his pocket. Old Amos Wandy lay still, as if resigned to their horrible fate. The clock ticked on relentlessly. With a shudder, the Hardys noted the time. 5 minutes before 3. The boys sank back, exhausted from their struggles. Only a miracle could save them now. A tremendous crashing of thunder shook the entire house. As it died away, Joe stared in fascination at the big front window. Strangely, one of the panes continued to rattle. Was it his imagination, or did he see a face pressed against the streaming glass where the draperies had parted a little? Joe squinted his eyes, hardly daring to believe them. There was a face peering in, a familiar one. Chet Morton! Frank had seen him too. The brothers looked at the clock. Less than 2 minutes left. Please, Chet, Frank begged silently, get in here. The stout boy did not hesitate. He pushed with all his weight upward against a sash. The window flew up. Chet clambered over the sill. In seconds, his sharp jackknife had sliced through Frank's ropes. Without a word, Frank dived forward, seized the wires, running from the black bomb to the clock, and tore him away. For a moment he stared at the wires, lined, tangled on the floor. Before either Chet or Frank could say anything, the clock struck. Bong, bong, bong. 3:00! Frank gasped, weak with relief. Chet, you sure got here in time to save our necks. Chet, who had set to work cutting away Joe's bonds, did not realize the disaster he had averted. Frank, by now, had pulled out his own knife, and freed Amos Wandy. The old man sat up with a groan, shaking from the recent ordeal. Thank heaven, he said fervently. Your friend is indeed a lifesaver. Joe rose from his chair and yanked the cloth from his mouth. Chet! He pounded his pal on the back. If we said thanks a million times, it wouldn't be enough. Whew! That was the closest squeak we ever had. Heaving a deep sigh of gratitude, he asked, How'd you know we were here, partner? Well, the chunky boy said, since I hadn't heard from you fellows by late afternoon, I went to your house right after supper. Aunt Gertrude was real worried, said you hadn't come home to eat. I waited with her until after midnight. Then she called the police. All of a sudden, I had a funny feeling you were here and in trouble, and thought I'd better come pronto to see what was up. So I did. And are we glad you had that funny feeling? Frank pointed. See that black thing? It's a time bomb. If you had been a minute later, we'd all have been blown to bits. Chet's ruddy face went white. He stared at the bomb, goggle-eyed. Oh, he squeaked, leaping backward as though fearful it would go off. Let's get out of here, quickly, miles away. I'm inclined to agree, said Amos Wandy wryly, slowly getting to his feet. But first, I must retrieve my invention. Frank rushed to assist him. Are you all right, Mr. Wandy? Jensen gave you a hard knock before he tied you up. Don't worry about me, young man. I'm just glad you boys were saved. The elderly man looked troubled. To think it really would have been my fault. I constructed that terrible bomb. But you didn't realize what it was for. That those crooks would use it on people who got in their way, and would destroy this house and all the evidence of what they'd done, Joe assured him solemnly. Hey, you detectives, Chet broke in. About time you filled me in on the latest doings in this zany place. We will, but first we better take cover. Dollars to dimes, Jensen will be back when he realizes the bomb didn't go off. Remember, Frank added, the police have his car, so he has no means of escape except on foot. Joe nodded. That low-down guy's really out of his mind, too. He may come back armed. Chet looked worried. Where do we hide? For answer, Frank pointed to the secret room behind the clock. Chet, noticing the open wall section for the first time, gaped in astonishment. Who ever thought of that? Amos Wandy turned off the overhead light, and the boys clicked on their flashlights. Then the old inventor led the way into the concealed room. Joe, who was last, clicked off the living room light, then pulled the wall section after him, leaving it open a crack. The boys glanced around the room. It was fairly large and well ventilated with air ducts. The Hardys figured it was directly under the secret chamber on the second floor. Their flashlight beams shone on a few pieces of furniture, a workbench, some tools, a hot plate, and a tiny refrigerator. All the comforts of home, Joe quipped. It did make a fairly good lab, Mr. Wandy recalled wistfully. As the group crouched in, waiting at the door, the Hardys gave Chet a rapid account of the evening's adventure. Yow! Their friend whistled in a stage whisper. I hope Mr. Dalrymple appreciates all the necks that have been risked on his case. Again, the Hardys pondered the possible whereabouts of the banker, but they dared not search the mansion for him at present. Eventually the four became silent as they kept their vigil. The thunder and lightning had diminished. Through the darkness came the familiar tick-tock. Tick-tock. But now, to Frank, Joe, and Mr. Wandy, it was no longer a dreaded sound. Suddenly, the four tensed. They had heard the front door being opened stealthily. Footsteps entered the living room, and the light came on. Joe put his eye to the crack. Jensen, he reported softly. The others crowded behind to peer out as well as they could. The ringleader had stopped short in his tracks and was staring fixedly at the disconnected bomb with its torn wire. Slowly, his gaze traveled to the two empty chairs and the cut ropes that had held his captives. Shall we jump him? Joe asked eagerly. Frank shook his head. Wait. All of a sudden, Jensen seemed to go into a frenzy. His face was livid with rage as he lifted one of the chairs and smashed it to the floor. "Escaped!" he shrieked. "How could they?" Beside himself with anger, the man pulled a revolver from his pocket. Aiming it at the ceiling, he shot repeatedly until the bullets were expended. "Good place for them," Joe whispered. Panting, Jensen looked about him wildly, dropping the pistol to the floor. Then suddenly he laughed. "There's one thing they can't prove. That is, if I destroy the invention." His voice took on a note of cunning. "Amos Wandy, I'll smash his precious invention. Smash it to bits." With that, the man wheeled, dashed out of the room, and raced up the stairs. "No," gasped Mr. Wandy. "I won't let him do it. I must stop him. We all will. Come on." Frank gave the signal, and the four quickly emerged from their hiding place. They raced into the front hall. From the dark stairwell, they heard Jensen's voice bellowing, "Those snoopers! They've ruined everything. I'll show 'em. Can't get the best of me that easy." The four pursuers ascended the steps, with Amos Wandy in the lead. So eager were the elderly man to rescue his invention that he even outdistanced the boys. "Mr. Wandy, be careful!" called Joe in warning. I must stop that scoundrel," returned the inventor, "before he reaches the roof." On the third-floor landing, he had to pause for breath. The boys soon caught up to him. Above stretched the flight of stairs leading to the attic. Frank aimed his flashlight upward into the inky blackness. Its beam revealed Arthur Jensen standing at the top, his back to them. "Okay, Jensen, you're outnumbered. Get down here and make it snappy," Frank shouted. Their enemy jerked around. For a split second, the man looked at them almost incredulously. "Come on, Jensen," snapped Joe. "You're finished." Unexpectedly, the big man plunged down the stairway toward them. He came at such a terrific speed that the sheer force of his weight and descent knocked them all down. He landed on top of the heap, grabbed the banister, got away, and pounded down the steps. "We mustn't let him get away," Frank yelled. "Chet, you and I will go after him. Joe, you rescue Mr. Wandy. He's heading for the roof. We can't let him climb out there. He's in no condition to do that." The boys scrambled apart and went in two directions. When Joe reached the attic, it was empty, but a damp breeze blew in from an open window. He rushed over and peered out. The rain was still falling steadily, and a cold wind had sprung up. Flickers of distant lightning cast a pale light across the sky. "Jeepers," Joe thought. "The poor old man must be out there already. It's very slippery, too." The open window faced the ridge of one of the steep slate roofs. In the faint light, halfway out along the ridge, Joe saw a brick chimney. "Mr. Wandy," Joe gasped. Clinging to the chimney was one arm, was the drenched, gaunt figure of Amos Wandy. Feet upon the sharp ridge, the old man stood in the chill wind and pelting rain, his free hand reaching for something. He might fall, the boy thought. "I must save him." Joe did not wait. He stepped out onto the rain-soaked ridge. Balancing himself carefully, he trod as swiftly as he dared toward the inventor. "Mr. Wandy," he shouted. "Wait, I'll help you. Don't move." The elderly man looked up. "All right, I guess I can't get it now." Finally, Joe was at Amos Wandy's side. "Easy," he cautioned. "Hang on to me. We'll go back slowly." No sooner had the pair turned away from the chimney than a powerful gust of wind struck the ridge, catching the inventor off guard. He lost his footing and fell, pulling Joe with him. Man and boy went tumbling down the slick slate surface toward the edge of the high roof. End of chapter 18. And that is the end of the two chapters that I'm reading today. I hope you enjoyed my reading. And we just have 2 more chapters to go before the book is finished. All right. Thank you. Have a great day.